Laughter echoed through the hangar as an old, chipped pickup truck rolled to a stop on the private runway of Westlake International Airport. Behind the reinforced glass of the VIP lounge, sharply dressed executives exchanged looks filled with doubt and disdain. Marcus Jennings, a 38-year-old black man with callous, scarred hands from years of labor, quietly opened his worn-out toolbox. His face showed no embarrassment, only focus, and a weariness built up over time. "Is this the expert they brought in to fix Mrs. Evans's jet?" Richard Hastings, chief operating officer of Evans Aerospace, asked with visible irritation. "I thought we asked for the best technician in the region, not someone who looks like they just walked out of a roadside garage." Marcus heard every word, clear as day, but didn't respond. He was used to this. These words no longer hurt him. They only reminded him that to survive and prove himself, he always had to work twice as hard as everyone else. What none of those executives knew was that those rough hands had once saved dozens of flight crews, had repaired issues entire teams couldn't diagnose. With 15 years of experience servicing luxury jets, Marcus had even won a National Engineering Award, but had never received the respect his talent deserved. Why? Because his skin color always arrived before his resume. A dispassionate voice crackled from the dispatcher. "Mrs. Evans' jet is scheduled to take off in 2 hours. Our team hasn't identified the issue. If you can't fix it in time, we'll call in a crew from Atlanta." The Gulfstream G650, a $65 million zero-cents marvel, gleamed in the morning sun like a giant diamond on the tarmac. As Marcus approached, he could feel the eyes from the lounge tracking his every move. Skeptical, dismissive, and then a different gaze. Not contempt, but observation, sharp, curious. "Let him work." The voice was crisp, cutting through the air like a blade. Alexandra Evans, 43, CEO of Evans Aerospace, strode across the runway with commanding poise. Her navy blue suit framed a petite but powerful figure. Her brown hair was impeccably styled, and her eyes fixed on Marcus, never once glancing at the other executives. "How much time do you need?" she asked, stopping in front of him, not impatient, but clearly weighing her options. "That depends on the problem, ma'am," Marcus replied, his eyes steady. No deference, just professionalism. "You have 1 hour, Alexandra said, eyes on her Rolex, a timepiece worth more than Marcus's annual salary. "Impress me." As the others retreated to the comfort of the air-conditioned lounge, Marcus opened the aircraft's main control panel. Within seconds, he uncovered a terrifying truth. The cabin pressurization system was nearly in total failure, a problem that previous texts had mistaken for a simple electrical issue. If the plane took off under those conditions, at 45,000 feet, the cabin would depressurize, and every passenger would be dead within minutes. His heart pounded, but his hands stayed steady. This wasn't a repair job anymore. It was a rescue mission. No thank yous were offered. Marcus didn't expect them. For people like him, flawless work was never seen as exceptional. It was the bare minimum assumed of him. No praise, no recognition, just silence and being overlooked. But this time something was different. Alexandra Evans returned, this time alone. No entourage, no rush. She walked straight toward Marcus, silent but sure, her eyes locked onto his, ignoring the confused stares of her staff. "How long would it have taken them to find the real problem?" she asked evenly, though doubt crept into her tone. "They never would have found it," Marcus replied plainly, his gaze unwavering. "If that plane had taken off, it would have gone down. No one would have survived." For a moment, time stood still. The weight of his words filled the air like a cold wind. Alexandra studied him closely, her eyes deep and calculating. "Come with me," she said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. The entire airport seemed to hold its breath. Richard Hastings, standing at the glass window, turned from red to pale, his fist clenched tight as if trying to contain a storm of fury. No one there realized that this moment would be more than just a story about a plane saved. It would be the beginning of a seismic journey, one that would shake generational prejudices and expose truths the luxury aviation industry had buried for decades. The biggest truth? The man who had just saved the jet was the very one who designed the G7 pressurization system, the technology used in half of Evans Aerospace's fleet. But the glory, the accolades, and the promotions had all gone to Richard Hastings. No one knew, except for what was buried in confidential files now in Alexandra Evans' hands. And now Marcus was walking with her toward the executive offices, leaving behind a wave of whispers, doubt, and tense stares. Richard Hastings stood frozen, his face twisted with fear. With every step Marcus took away from the hangar, it was as if another nerve inside Hastings stretched tighter, like a bowstring on the verge of snapping. "Into my office," Alexandra said, leading Marcus into a restricted area. Few senior executives were allowed to enter. They walked in silence, the rhythmic click of shoes on the gleaming tile floor echoing in the hallway. Alexandra's office was a flawless blend of luxury and functionality. Soft light from large windows bathed the space in a serious but not cold atmosphere. She closed the door gently and motioned for Marcus to sit. She took her place behind a wide desk. "Have you ever told me your full name?" Alexandra asked, her gaze scanning every detail of his face. "Marcus Jennings," he replied calmly. Silence filled the room for a few seconds as Alexandra tapped on her personal tablet. Then her eyes widened slightly, eyebrows lifting. "Marcus Jennings. MJ," she repeated, as if a final piece had just clicked into place, the initials engraved on every early schematic of the G7 pressurization system. Marcus's expression remained composed, but his fingers curled tightly around the armrest, not from fear, but from the rush of memories and injustices crashing over him like a wave. 3 patents, 4 innovation awards, a master's in aerospace engineering, and you're out here fixing jets like a regular mechanic? Alexandra asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and emerging respect. "Because no one hires a black engineer from a poor neighborhood to lead a development team," Marcus replied, steady and firm. "And even mechanics have bills to pay, ma'am." Without a word, Alexandra opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were detailed technical documents on the G7 system, all bearing Richard Hastings' signature and his title, Chief Engineer. Their eyes met, but this time it wasn't suspicion. It was the unspoken promise of an impending upheaval in the aviation industry, triggered by a truth buried for far too long. "Do you know how much profit that system has brought my company over the past 5 years?" Alexandra asked, flipping through the pages like weighing a verdict. Her tone was calm, but sharp with inquiry. "Roughly $428 million, 0 cents, Marcus answered without hesitation. "It saves 23% on fuel and cuts maintenance costs by 31%. Alexandra's eyes lifted in surprise, taken aback by the precision of his response. She hadn't expected the man sitting across from her, a supposed airplane mechanic, to have such a deep grasp of the strategic numbers. Richard received 3 promotions and a $2.5 million bonus for his accomplishments, she continued. "And I," Marcus interjected softly, his voice steady, "kept fixing planes." At that moment, a hurried knock echoed through the room, followed by the door swinging open. Richard Hastings walked in without being invited. His face was tense, the worry barely masked by a forced smile. "Alexandra, the board is waiting on the video call and we really need to—" He froze when he saw Marcus, his expression quickly shifting to annoyance. "What is he still doing here? The job's done." "Actually, we're discussing intellectual property," Alexandra replied calmly, not even looking at him. "Specifically, the G7 system." Richard visibly paled. "I don't see what a mechanic could possibly contribute to this conversation." "How interesting," Alexandra said, tilting her head slightly. "Because I happen to be holding the original blueprints for the G7 system, marked with the initials MJ. And I just learned they belong to Marcus Jennings, who worked in the development division 5 years ago." "Alexandra, that's absurd," Richard scoffed, trying to regain control. He was just a junior tech. The G7 system was entirely the product of the team I led. The door opened again. A middle-aged woman stepped in, holding a file folder thicker than Alexandra's entire report. Marcus recognized her immediately. Dr. Sophia Chun, Chief Legal Officer of Evans Aerospace, a familiar face from countless internal briefings. "Apologies for being late, Alexandra," she said, nodding slightly at Marcus before turning to Richard with a sharp gaze. "I've reviewed all the intellectual property files, and yes, the digital signatures on the original documents match Mr. Marcus Jennings. Not Richard." Silence fell across the room. Richard was speechless, scrambling for any defense. There must be a mistake. He worked under me. If he contributed anything, it was minimal." "Minimal?" Alexandra cut in, opening another file on her tablet. "Richard, I have here emails you sent to HR requesting Marcus Jennings be terminated for technical incompetence, exactly 3 days after he submitted the entire G7 project to the internal system." In that moment, Marcus remained composed, a calm so profound even he was surprised by it. 5 years ago, escorted out of the building like a criminal, he'd sworn that the truth would one day be revealed. But he'd never imagined it would come this soon and like this. "Mr. Jennings," Alexandra said, turning to him, her tone serious but not cold, "Dr. Chun has prepared some documents and she'd like you to review them." Marcus gave a small nod, his heart pounding in his chest, not from fear, but because for the first time he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for. Justice. "Essentially, we're proposing retroactive recognition of your authorship," Alexandra said, her voice clear yet dignified, "along with financial compensation for all unpaid royalties and one offer." "What kind of offer?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice steady though a storm churned within him. "Pound that could rewrite history," Alexandra replied crisply, then turned to Richard Hastings. "Richard, you are hereby suspended pending the results of an internal investigation. Please surrender your employee badge to security." Richard froze. His face turned ghostly white, as if every cell in his body had just been electrocuted. "You can't do this." "The board won't. They'll be notified within the hour," Alexandra interrupted, cutting him off before he could continue. "And if you want to keep any shred of dignity, I suggest you walk out that door now, before I call security." The door slammed shut. No one needed to say a word to acknowledge what had just happened. An empire was crumbling. Alexandra turned back, her expression calmer than ever. "Now we can finally begin." In the next 2 hours, not only Marcus's fate, but the very power structure within Evans Aerospace began to shift. As Sophia flipped through the legal documents, Marcus looked at Alexandra and saw something that stunned him. She wasn't just righting a wrong. There was something in her eyes, a clarity that transcended empathy, as if she too was fighting an enemy only she could see. And indeed, Alexandra Evans carried a secret of her own. Her briefcase didn't just contain documents about the G7 system. It also held evidence from a 2-year covert investigation exposing systemic discrimination and the theft of intellectual property within her own company. Marcus Jennings wasn't the first victim, but he was the brightest, the one who left a trail impossible to ignore. Alexandra had waited patiently for the right moment to dismantle a rotten system from the inside. Meanwhile, in the airport parking lot, Richard Hastings was making a desperate call to allies on the board. The empire he'd built was collapsing, piece by piece, but he still had one final card to play. The documents and backroom connections Richard possessed could not only destroy Marcus's reputation, but potentially drag Alexandra Evans down with him. What he didn't know was that every move he made was being watched, every call recorded, and the real battle had only just begun. Alexandra's private conference room felt like another world, completely detached from the bustling airport outside. Marcus sat stiffly in the leather chair as Alexandra quietly closed the door, sealing them off from the noise and glare above. The pressurization system you just repaired, that was an upgraded version of the G7, wasn't it? Alexandra began, her voice light but laced with implication. Marcus maintained his calm. Yes, ma'am. A version I designed based on the original framework. A system Richard Hastings claimed as his own, earning himself a 7-figure bonus, Alexandra said, sliding a folder toward him. A system whose original blueprint bears the initials MJ. The room fell into silence, but it was a charged silence, as if the truth was finally stepping into the light. 5 years ago, Alexandra continued, you were a junior engineer at Evans Aerospace, and you were terminated for technical incompetence just 3 days after you submitted the full G7 design to the system. Marcus took a deep breath. That memory was still vivid, like it had happened yesterday, the day he was pulled from his office under the scornful eyes of his co-workers. And now, in that very building beside the person with the highest authority, the truth was finally being heard. I've got bills to pay too, ma'am, Marcus replied steadily. Even mechanics have families to support. Alexandra leaned forward, her eyes drilling into his like she was trying to reach his very core. You know what else I discovered, Mr. Jennings, she said slowly. You're not the only one. Over the past 10 years, 7 other talented employees were fired under suspiciously similar circumstances. All of them were either Black or Latinx, and all of them were let go not long after contributing revolutionary ideas. The door opened again. This time a neatly dressed woman entered, holding a tablet. Sorry I'm late. Alexandra turned to Marcus. Marcus, this is Dr. Vanessa Chun, our new chief legal advisor. Vanessa has been leading an internal investigation for the past 8 months. Vanessa nodded to Marcus, then said, Mr. Jennings, we've gathered clear evidence of systemic intellectual property theft within Evans Aerospace. Those words hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. Memories surged like a flood. The long nights alone in the lab, the thrill of solving the pressurization equation the team had struggled with, Hastings' dagger-sharp glare when he saw the results, and the crushing humiliation of being escorted out like a criminal. Why are you telling me all this? He asked, his voice dropping. Because I need your help, Alexandra replied. Richard Hastings controls half the board. He has powerful allies. I need an irrefutable piece of evidence to bring him down. And what do I get? Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. Recognition, Alexandra said without hesitation. Financial compensation for all the royalties you were denied, and... She paused, then added, the position of Chief Innovation Officer, the role you should have had 5 years ago. Marcus let out a quiet laugh, not bitter, just the kind of laugh that comes when a wound is finally acknowledged. You really think the board will accept a black mechanic as head of innovation? For the first time, Alexandra smiled. They won't have a choice once they realize what's at stake. Vanessa handed Marcus a document. This is a confidentiality agreement. Everything we discuss here. A hurried knock interrupted her. Without waiting for an invitation, Richard Hastings barged in. His expression looked like it had been molded from a mask of false charm. Alexandra, the board is waiting. And why is this contractor still here? We're discussing the G7 system, Alexandra answered, her gaze unflinching. Richard's face slowly drained of color. I don't see what a mechanic can possibly contribute to advanced aerospace engineering. How fascinating, isn't it? Alexandra held up the tablet. This is the original schematic, marked with the initials MJ. Seems like that mechanic is actually the inventor. Richard gave a strained smile. He was just a junior tech. If he contributed anything, it was negligible. Negligible? Alexandra cut in, her tone glacial. I have an email from you to HR recommending Mr. Jennings be terminated for technical incompetence, sent 3 days after he submitted the complete G7 design. Richard briefly lost his composure, then quickly regained it. Alexandra, we have an important video conference. The board won't wait around to listen to these baseless theories. Alexandra stood, her expression no longer tolerant. "Richard, you're suspended until the internal investigation concludes." "You can't do this," he shouted. "The board won't. They'll be informed within the next hour." The atmosphere froze, and this time the one leaving the room wasn't Marcus Jennings. "Keep what little dignity you have left and walk out," Alexandra said coldly. As the door slammed shut, she turned to Marcus, eyes lit with determination. "We have 2 weeks until the general shareholders' meeting. I need concrete evidence before then." Marcus rose slowly, his gaze no longer just calm, it was resolute. "I have something better than evidence," he said. "I'm finally ready. I still have the original G7 prototype, complete with all technical notes, timestamps, and my digital signature." Alexandra paused, surprised, but Marcus wasn't done. "And I have recordings," he continued, eyes locking with hers, "from 5 years ago. Recordings of Hastings, every word, explaining how to erase my name from the system, how to orchestrate a smear campaign, how to claim the invention as his own." Dr. Chun leaned forward, clearly shocked. "How did you get those recordings?" Marcus smiled for the first time since stepping into the room. "I grew up in one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city, fixing old electronics to survive. I learned early that people like me always need living proof to defend against people like him." What Alexandra Evans hadn't anticipated was that Marcus hadn't just preserved evidence for his own case. Over 5 years working as an aircraft technician, he had quietly documented, archived, and compiled data on stolen innovations, buried talents, and the racial bias embedded in the organization. His humble appearance was the perfect camouflage. While fixing jets for the elite, Marcus had been stockpiling fuel to ignite a rotten system. Richard Hastings had assumed he was dealing with a failed mechanic. He never realized he was standing across from a technical genius. And more than that, a strategist who knew how to turn invisibility into a deadly weapon. 6 months later, Heaven's aerospace headquarters had transformed beyond recognition. The executive floor, once dominated by white men, now reflected a new reality, diverse, balanced, and progressive, just as Alexandra had promised. At the center of that transformation stood Marcus Jennings, no longer the quiet mechanic with calloused hands, but the chief innovation officer leading the team behind the revolutionary G7 system. The special shareholder meeting months prior had made corporate history. Alexandra Evans, flanked by Dr. Chun, presented the full, undeniable chain of evidence exposing racism and intellectual property theft. Then, the audio recording played for a packed auditorium. "We need to get rid of that delusional mechanic," came Richard Hastings' voice, cold and contemptuous. "Take the system, wipe out her trail. Who's going to believe a black woman from the ghetto came up with something that sophisticated? Clients trust us, not people like her." The room cracked open in outrage, a silence shattered by murmurs that swelled into a wave of fury. Company stock dropped 18% that same day, but what came afterward shook the industry even more. "I could have filed a private lawsuit," Marcus said in his first interview with Aviation Technology magazine. But this was never just about Richard Hastings. It's about a system. The solution Marcus proposed, and which Alexandra fully supported, wasn't just justice for one person. It was reform for an entire industry. And the story of a black mechanic who dared to reclaim the truth became a symbol of hope, equity, and the power of perseverance. Evans Aerospace didn't just right a wrong. Alexandra signed a landmark resolution, a special audit program to verify and reward all employees whose intellectual property had been stolen over the past decade. But she didn't stop there. A new innovation fund was established, dedicated to communities historically pushed to the margins. Meanwhile, Richard Hastings faced a wave of lawsuits. His professional licenses were revoked, and his reputation destroyed so completely he couldn't even land a job at third-tier consulting firms. The man who once mocked Marcus on the tarmac was now forgotten and regarded as a disgraced failure unworthy of sympathy. Revenge was never my goal, Marcus told Alexandra during the inauguration of the Evans Aerospace Community Technology Development Center, built in the very neighborhood where he grew up. Justice was, and more than anything, presence. The center was more than just a building. It was a symbol of a dream once buried in dust. Under Marcus's guidance, teens who once had no access to education were now responsible for 3 revolutionary patents. Ideas born from a place long deemed hopeless had become the new hope of the aerospace industry. You know what's ironic? Alexandra asked as they watched a group of students eagerly testing a new prototype. If Hastings had shared the credit with you from the start, he'd probably still be an executive. Marcus gave a faint smile, his eyes distant. Greed blinds people to the true potential of others. What surprised him most was the proposal Alexandra brought up 3 months after he took the role. Not just a promotion, but a partnership, in every sense of the word. Marcus thought she was joking when she proposed a merger. Not marriage, as the media speculated, but a corporate one. Throughout his 5 years as a mechanic, Marcus had quietly maintained a small engineering firm operating out of his home garage. Today, that firm owns 30% of Evans Aerospace. The executives who once laughed at him on that runway either resigned or now sit silently, having learned the industry's greatest lesson: talent and integrity have no color. On the 1-year anniversary of the incident, Alexandra hosted a special event. Every employee was invited to witness the unveiling of a new propulsion system developed by Marcus's team, a technology that could cut fuel consumption in commercial aviation by up to 40%. A year ago, many of you witnessed a black man mocked while saving dozens of lives. Alexandra began her speech. Today, that man isn't just saving our industry or our planet. He's resurrecting dreams long buried under prejudice. Marcus looked around the auditorium. Faces that were once cold and dismissive now stood and applauded. He didn't take pride in their change. He knew many clapped for optics, not awakening, but he didn't care, because what made all his efforts worthwhile were the young engineers, diverse in race, gender, and background, who not long ago would have never had a chance to walk into this building, and now they sat in the front row. And among them in the front row sat someone special, Marcus's mother, Mrs. Jennings, now 72, who had spent her life scrubbing floors in corporate towers so her son could one day walk into college. There were no tears. This was not a day for crying. It was a day to prove that justice doesn't need a shout, only to arrive at the right time. Her eyes glistened, not with sadness, but pride. No longer was she the woman who once quietly mopped the cold halls of power. She now sat in a seat of honor, watching her son, the boy who once walked to class in worn-out shoes, standing on stage, no longer just a mechanic, but a living symbol of justice fulfilled. Real change, Marcus concluded in his speech, his voice echoing through the silent auditorium, doesn't happen when someone like me breaks through barriers and achieves personal success. It happens when we open the door and ensure that talent is never wasted because of irrational bias. True justice isn't about individual victory. It's about restructuring the system itself. The story of a mechanic becoming co-owner of an aerospace corporation has inspired an entire generation of young engineers from marginalized communities. Similar programs began emerging across other major corporations, partly due to social pressure, but mostly because they could no longer deny the truth. The resounding success of Evans Aerospace came from turning diversity into more than a slogan. It became a practical winning strategy. Of course, success can't erase the scars of a lifetime of discrimination, but it gave Marcus a weapon far more powerful than anger: positive influence. And as he watched the young students working diligently in the Community Tech Center, a place he once only dreamed could be a single classroom, Marcus realized that his greatest victory wasn't the title or the fortune. It was the pure, unburdened look in the eyes of those children. Eyes untainted by doubt, unclouded by the shame he once carried through his own youth. The best response to prejudice isn't one person climbing to the top, it's building a path, a wide-open corridor where others don't have to scale towering walls just to be deemed worthy. If this story of turning discrimination into collective triumph has touched your heart, then stay with us for what comes next. Stories that will continue to prove an undeniable truth. Sometimes the most noble act isn't climbing over the wall, it's tearing it down so no one else has to. If you believe that justice shouldn't be a privilege, but a basic right for every human being, if you believe that difference isn't a barrier but the engine of innovation, and if Marcus Jennings' journey moved you, inspired you, or simply made you think, then don't forget to hit subscribe, click like, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next powerful, true story. Stories that remind us, when one person dares to rise, an entire generation finds hope. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We'll see you in the next video where we continue exploring the incredible things that courage and belief can make possible.